all the evidence against P. Diddy. We're talking literal evidence collected during the federal raids. Photos and videos of alleged abuse, text message exchanges, and of course, bombshell testimony. We're sitting down with Johnny Depp's attorney to break down the most damning pieces of evidence against P. Diddy. This is Scandal, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Sierra Gillespie. Believe it or not, we're nearly to the midway point in the P. Diddy federal trial. We've seen a lot of evidence from the government during all of this, and to be honest, some of it isn't looking too good for P. Diddy. He's actually known by a lot of different names. Recently, we've been hearing a lot of witnesses call him Puff or Puff Daddy. He's known as Diddy, P. Diddy, Love, but legally, he's Sean Combs. And he's actually kind of in some legal trouble too. Namely, 5 federal charges, including racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He's pleaded not guilty to all of these charges. Right now, we're in the government's case in chief, and so far we've seen a lot of evidence. So let's dig into some of the most damning evidence that jurors have seen so far. And it's only right to begin a P. Diddy story talking about evidence, of course, by talking about baby oil and lube. Because you'll recall, over 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lube were collected during federal raids of Diddy's homes, and some sex toys were collected too. Jurors have actually seen the photos. You can see from the photos yourself, there's a decent amount of these items. Now, Cassie testified about all of this, and this is the government. Q means the government, A is Cassie. The government says, you mentioned baby oil. What brand of baby oil was used? Johnson's baby oil. How was the baby oil used during the freak-off? It was just as important as everything else, as being there. We used it quite a bit. Where was it? Where was the baby oil placed? We poured it all over our bodies. Had to be glistening. Yeah. Which participants in the freak-off, if any, used the baby oil? Everyone. Would that include you? Yes. Other witness testimony has corroborated all of this. For instance, a male dancer escort, a man by the name of Sheree Hayes, who, if you don't recall that name, you might recall his little moniker, the Punisher. He testified about it too. Here's what he said. She, meaning Cassie, explained to me that her and her husband like to create a sexy scene that consisted of me and her mutually applying baby oil, applying it to ourselves and to possibly each other, and try to create a sexy environment that her husband would eventually come out to watch. The government asked, across all these encounters, you mentioned you would use baby oil. Is that right? Yes. And how much? A considerable amount. It was preferred to keep our bodies, covered for, the look of it, to shine, or whatever was the preference. Cassie testified that these freak-offs happened kind of a lot. The government asked, how frequently did you have freak-offs with Sean after they started? After they started, they became almost weekly, I would say. And they kind of lasted for a while, too. This is Cassie's transcript again. How much time out of your week did freak-offs take? It would depend on how long they were. They ranged anywhere from 36, 48 to 72 hours. I feel like the longest one ever was 4 days, maybe even more, like on and off with breaks. So it was a significant part of the week. And the oil was kind of messy. Back to Cassie's transcripts. After a freak-off, can you describe the condition of the room where the freak-off was held? The room was usually pretty bad off. There was oil all over the walls, the door handles, the bed, the sheets. We often would get to the room. I would need to call and ask for extra linens and towels and stuff like that to try to mitigate those problems, but oil, candle wax, all over the place. Another piece of evidence having to do with all of this was the cleanup and the record of that. This came from a Beverly Hills hotel employee who talked about a bill for Diddy was once $300 specifically just for deep cleaning. The government asked, what does deep cleaning mean? So deep cleaning is essentially when the scope of cleaning is beyond what is normal. So sometimes when something is very dirty or stained or whatnot, we have to send it out. So that's when we would do a deep cleaning. On a separate instance, Diddy had his bill for, the room, the valet parking, all that stuff. But then there was a separate bill, $500 in all for oil damage. What is a miscellaneous charge for oil damage? So essentially, it was, again, beyond the scope of what we would normally clean. So we probably had to either send it out or we had to bring somebody in to deep clean the room. Speaking of hotels, another major piece of evidence involves the Intercontinental Hotel and the video. Now, Diddy's team admitted This is abuse. This is from defense's openings. They said, first, what Combs did to Cassie on this videotape is indefensible. It is horrible. It's dehumanizing. It's violent. It's virtually every bad word you can think of. And while it's dehumanizing and violent and terrible, the second most important thing is that it is not evidence of sex trafficking. It is evidence of domestic violence. You will see that it is also evidence of the central theme in this case, which is jealousy. That's what this videotape shows you. The caveat here is that Diddy's team says, okay, it's physical abuse, but it's not sex trafficking. The government side of things, though, says, okay, this proves retaliation in regards to sex trafficking. This was after Cassie left a freak off, and you see how Diddy reacted. We'll talk about this during our interview with Ben Chu, too. And this leads into our next piece of major evidence, Cassie's testimony. She even talked about this intercontinental situation. The government asked, okay, inside the hotel room at a high level, can you describe to the jury what happened? Inside the hotel room, we were having a freak off. She testified that Diddy hit her midway through all of this. After he hit me, and I saw the result of it, I knew I had to get out. So when he was distracted, I don't know exactly what he was doing. He was either in the shower or on the phone. I just grabbed my stuff and ran out as fast as I could. Cassie testified about this specific instance of physical abuse and other allegations, and even some visuals were shown to the jurors. She also talked about threats about her participation in freak-offs. The government asked, what concerns did you have if Sean was threatening you? That he could put these videos out and ruin everything for me, embarrass me, just make me out to be somebody that I'm not in a very unfair way? I mean, the leverage of having an incriminating or derogatory, humiliating video of somebody telling them they're going to release it if you don't behave the way they want you to, or whatever the case may be. It was just always like that. Like, that was a big part of our relationship. And who told you that the videos would be released? Sean. And I just want to specify, these are the videos that were allegedly taken during the freak-offs. That according to Cassie, Diddy said, yeah, if you don't behave, if you don't follow these rules, if you don't do X, Y, Z, I'm going to release the video. And there's actually corroborating witness testimony about her allegations too. So let's start with the physical abuse. First, we've got Dawn Richard from Danity Kane. She said she witnessed multiple times that Diddy was violent physically with Cassie. She said at one point, he grabbed her by the neck and popped her in... He slapped her in the mouth, told her to shut the F up. You say that he popped her in the mouth. What do you mean by that? Like an open hand slap to the mouth. Cassie's former friend Carrie Morgan also testified and talked about this too. She said, I saw him push her to the ground and she hit her head on the brick. How did you see Miss Ventura react after she hit her head on the brick? She didn't move. And how was her body positioned? She fell on her side, so she was like this and her hands were kind of out. She was like a loose fetal position, I would say. Other witnesses corroborated Cassie's testimony about some of the threats, and this one's kind of a hybrid, testimony and photographic evidence, when Diddy allegedly blew up Kid Cudi's car. So there are the pics, but there's also Kid Cudi's testimony about this. What did you see when you arrived home? Just the damage? I saw the Molotov cocktail. Yeah. Are these photographs that we just looked at similar to what you saw when you arrived home? Yeah. When you say I saw the Molotov cocktail, what did you see? The bottle, and it was kind of just burnt up. What was your understanding of whether this was accidental or intentional? It was intentional. This is all after the situation in which Kid Cudi and Cassie had a relationship. He said he later met up with Diddy at the Soho House in California. He said Sean Combs was standing there, staring out the window with his hands behind his back like a Marvel supervillain, which, by the way, may be the best imagery I've heard in this trial so far. The government asked, can you describe how the meeting with Mr. Combs ended at the Soho House? Yeah, we stood up, shook hands, and as I was shaking his hand, I said, what are we going to do about my car? I made sure to ask him right when our hands were clasped together, where he couldn't run away and I could look him square in his eyes. And he looked right back at me, very cold stare, and said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, okay. I took my hand from his and he said, wait, I thought we were cool. Is there a problem? I was like, you said you didn't burn my car, right? You said that's your word? He said, yeah. I was like, that's it. Can you describe what happened when you saw him at the Soho House a few years later? Yeah, he was with his daughter and he pulled me to the side and basically apologized for everything. He said, and I quote, Man, I just want to apologize for everything and all that BS. There's also corroborating testimony about this revenge porn that Diddy would allegedly release if Cassie didn't fall in line. We actually heard this from Cassie's mom, Regina Ventura. She read an email out loud to jurors from Cassie saying that the Ventura family needed to pay P. Diddy $20,000 in order not to release the sex tapes. Regina Ventura testified, "I was physically sick. I did not understand a lot of it. The sex tapes threw me. I did not know the other person in it, but I knew he was going to try to hurt my daughter." When you say you knew he was trying to hurt your daughter, who is the he that you were talking about? Sean Combs. There's been more testimony about alleged physical and sexual assault too, including from Mia, Diddy's former assistant. The government asked Mia, "Was Mr. Combs ever violent toward you?" "Yes." "What are some of the violent things that Mr. Combs has done to you?" "He has thrown things at me. He has thrown me against the wall. He's thrown me into a pool. He has thrown an ice bucket on my head. He has slammed my arm into a door. He has also sexually assaulted me." "Did Mr. Combs sexually assault you on one occasion or more than one occasion?" "More than one." "Did you ever want to engage in any sexual activity with Mr. Combs?" "No." "Over what period of time did the sexual assaults occur?" I'm not sure of the years, but they were sporadic." "Were they sporadic during your employment with Mr. Combs?" "Yes." And that's really just a small taste of the evidence the government has brought so far. I know how I'm reacting to it, but I need an expert opinion to break it all down for me. So let's jump to our interview now with Johnny Depp's former attorney. All right, we're joined now by trial attorney Ben Chu. Ben, thank you for coming on and making your scandal debut. And I've got to start talking about Diddy and evidence. I mean, I've got to ask about the lube and the baby oil because that's what everybody's been talking about. And now the jury has actually seen photos of this. They've heard from federal officers who went and collected all of this. However, to me, I mean, it's not illegal to have lube and sex toys. So does this help the government's, I guess, their case about sex trafficking and RICO and all that?
I suppose, but I kind of share your puzzlement about this. I don't think that these materials are that probative of sex trafficking. So I don't know what the focus is on that.
I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of it, and I've never seen 1,000 bottles of baby oil, all together. But to your point, I don't know how it necessarily relates. And that kind of leads into my next question. So by now, we've all seen that really famous Intercontinental video. And P. Diddy's team even says, hand up, okay, that was domestic violence. When he attacked Cassie, yes, it was. But domestic violence isn't sex trafficking. It isn't racketeering conspiracy. So while it is jarring, I mean, is it helping the government?
Yeah, I think in that case, I think that does help the government. You're absolutely right. I don't think it goes to the elements of RICO or even sex trafficking, but I do think it establishes for the jury that this is a bad guy. And I think that was something that they wanted to do at the outset. And I think it was less related to the elements they need to prove, but just setting the factual predicate that this is a person who has the character who might engage in sex trafficking. So I think it's a little elliptical, but I think it hits the head much more than the baby oil, which not only is not illegal, but it can be used for a lot of different things.
Right, that's a great point. Back to this video though. Cassie actually we heard from her testifying about all of this, and I think it was really helpful. I mean, she was on the stand for several days, but if we're talking specifically about this incident at the Intercontinental Hotel, she said, "I was leaving a freak off and then I was attacked." So, does that kind of connect the dots there that it was sex trafficking in a way, allegedly?
That's a great point. They do link it there, and they linked it yesterday through Eddie Garcia because, as you know, this is the hotel employee who, with his manager, ultimately sold the videotape or one copy of the videotape for $100,000. Now, I think that does play into the racketeering because Diddy's assistant was involved. She made the first approach. And when that didn't bear fruit, Diddy himself came in. And they came in personally. When there's a threatening element, or you can argue there's a threatening element to that. And the fact that he paid in $100,000 of cash in a brown paper bag also suggests that there's something not on the up and up about it. It's not something you or I would do. We pay our debts with checks or online. we don't generally carry around, at least I'm sure you don't either, a
I
hundred thousand
don't
dollars
know.
in cash.
I mean, I would like to say that I just have that lying around, but no, I do not have that. And actually, I'm glad you brought up Eddie Garcia because I wanted to talk about him a bit. He said at the time he was making $10.50 an hour. And he signed this NDA, this document that says if you tell anyone about this, you're going to have to pay $1 million for breach of contract. So obviously, it doesn't seem like this guy has $1 million, at least at the time. And he says he was so stressed out that Diddy was really pressuring him, that he was scared about all of that. Do you think that goes to help the government?
Absolutely. And also the very fact of an NDA, the fact that the inferences that they had it handy suggests that Eddie Garcia was not the first and wouldn't be the last to receive this. It suggests something much more systemic. I mean, it's something that you or I would draft as attorneys for our clients, but usually not in a context like this.
It's interesting to hear his testimony and what happened. And as you're saying, kind of like the organization, which again kind of goes to what the government is saying, that this was an enterprise, that it wasn't just Diddy, it was his team, his associates. And we talked about Cassie. I got to go back to her though, because she was on the stand for multiple days and had a lot of testimony talking about what she says she went through. Overall, what do you think of Cassie's testimony?
I think it was quite probative, and I have to say, I didn't think much of the cross-examination. I mean, I think if this were a case of he said, she said, and there were only one accuser, fine, you have to go hard against her. Although even, whenever you're dealing with an alleged victim, or in this case, from the video, a victim of domestic abuse, you've got to be very careful. But also here, they're dealing with more than one victim. You had Mia testify about what happened to her. And I think in that context, going hard against the witness, I don't know what it gets you. If there's more than one, you got to try a different tack.
Let's talk about Mia too, because as you said, there are multiple accusers in all of this. One even expected to start testifying today. But we did hear from Mia kind of long testimony similar to Cassie. And if we talk about cross exam, just because that's happened most recently, Brian Steele went in on her a bit and was saying, okay, what's your motive for all of this? Why did you come forward? It's interesting, you didn't come out during this Me Too movement. You waited a while. You saw that Cassie got a payoff. You yourself got a payoff. What do you make of the cross exam there?
I have to say, and I don't like criticizing other attorneys, and I know they had to deal with what they had, but I did not think that the climax of that cross-examination, well, you're not really a victim, are you? And you really, everything you're saying is false, isn't it? Well, you know the answer you're going to get to that, and actually her answer was very strong. And I just didn't think it was that effective. Now, maybe part of that is performative. You have to try to appeal to your client. Maybe that's what the client wanted. But part of the role of the attorney, as you know, is to do what's in the client's best interest, not necessarily what the client thinks is in his or her best interest. I think that fell flat, and I don't know what answer he possibly could have expected except the one he got, which is I'm telling the truth. I wouldn't lie about this.
And when you're the attorney doing something like that, the cross exam, you have to think about the jury too, right? Because we just heard a lengthy direct from her where she had to talk about this alleged abuse. And even me going through reading the transcripts, it was hard to read. I mean, she's talking about some really difficult stuff that happened over and over again, that, traumatizing. So then for the defense to come at her and say, is this true? What is your motive? All of that. Do they have to be thinking about the jury and how the jury would react to that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's really all that matters. I mean, you want to make sure you're not running afoul of the judge, but ultimately your audience is the jury. And I just don't think that's effective. I mean, there are things you can do. You could have had a much lighter cross and use the answers for closing argument. You're not going to get it from this witness, but what you can say in closing, you heard from her. You heard that she took or that she had a payout. In the context of her lawsuit, she didn't even allege sexual abuse. You have to ask these questions. This isn't a sexual abuse trial. Why did they focus on this? They focused on this because they wanted to distract you from the fact that they didn't have evidence that supports the elements of this overcharge. You can make a very good closing argument without offending the jury by going after somebody who appears credible. Now, obviously, you and I don't know what actually happened in that case, although we did see the Cassie Ventura tape. But I just think that's a losing battle.
I agree. It'll be interesting to see what happens for the next witness. I believe it's Jane that's going to testify what the cross would be if the defense decides to change their method or, what they're trying to do. It'll kind of be interesting to see. And before we move on to my next question, I do have to talk about Jane's direct a bit more because as I said, it was hard, honestly, just to read. And I can't imagine for the jury to have to hear the specifics. And our whole episode on Scandal today is about evidence. So her testifying and talking at length about these allegations, do you think that's a win for the government?
I do. I think it goes back to the prevailing theme, right or not, because we don't know what happened, but that this is a bad guy and that this wasn't a one-off with Cassie Ventura, that this is the way this gentleman or this man behaved. And it's not the way most people behave.
If we're going to the theory about him being a bad guy, I got to talk about Kid Cudi because he had this relationship with Cassie kind of amidst her relationship with Diddy. The lines were kind of blurred about what was going on there, but he had a thing with Cassie. And then all of a sudden he comes onto the stand and we see these photos of his car, a Molotov cocktail. It seems as though Diddy attempted to blow it up in a way. Again, all allegations. He wasn't charged with that. But what do you think about that? Showing that he allegedly put this man's life in danger. Does that go to the theory that he's a bad guy?
Absolutely. And that also kind of brings in the enterprise element of it because there were other people allegedly involved. Now, what if I were the defense, I would stress the temporal difference, you know, between the time that Diddy allegedly appeared in Kid Cudi's house, and then I think it was several weeks later
Mm-hmm.
when this incident with the convertible and the Molotov cocktail occurred. But I think the government has actually done a good job at making that case, and because listening to the testimony, it seems to be a logical inference that somebody who would break into somebody's house, lock somebody's dog in the bathroom, has it in for Kid Cudi, and unless there's some other enemy of Kid Cudi out there, I think it's reasonable for the jury to conclude that he was responsible for the Molotov cocktail, which is very chilling because not only could you have hurt or killed Kid Cudi, you could have hurt an innocent bystander on the streets.
You brought up a really good point there too that I guess I hadn't even thought about because I'm so entrenched in all of this. When I take a step back, the fact that there are these two allegations back to back, the break-in, and then as you said, about a month later is when this Molotov cocktail situation is. So perhaps that's showing a pattern of these alleged incidences in which Diddy or his associates would break in and threaten him. And I guess I want to talk about the associates too, because this is a question I get from a lot of people who are watching Scandal. They're like, okay, so he's charged with RICO, racketeering, conspiracy. There have to be multiple people to kind of prove that, but Diddy's the only defendant. So can you explain all that to me?
Well, that happens, as you know, in many cases where you just go after the kingpin. So it's not that unusual, to build up to the top and to not indict the, alleged co-conspirators. But I think that's fodder for the closing argument for Diddy's counsel to say this is an alleged conspiracy. We're the other defendants. This is part of an overcharge. This really was a domestic violence case dressed up as a RICO action. And, in the United States, this is not how it's done. You don't have to like my defendant. And, we've already conceded, that video was horrific, but that was a different point in time. That was almost 10 years ago. He's apologized for it. And this is a case of vengeance and overcharging. And I mean, that's the argument that I think they can make, and not having other defendants there kind of opens the door for that. Now, whether that carries the day obviously is up to the jury.
I'm very interested to see what's coming from the defense because right now, obviously, we're still in the government, the prosecution case. So when the defense comes, which I'll ask you about in a minute, but first I want us to wrap up the prosecution and their side of things. We've heard from probably a dozen, maybe more witnesses throughout all of this. We've talked about the star testimony of Mia, Cassie, maybe even Kid Cudi because he's a big name and what happened was potentially life-threatening. But what about all these other witnesses that have been called? I mean, we've heard from investigators or people who were allegedly bribed by P. Diddy, people who witnessed this alleged abuse. Overall, what do you think about the witnesses so far that the government has called?
I think they're strong, and I think they're diverse in terms of the roles, what they do for a living, I think that's very powerful. And even if there are some discrepancies in the testimony, there were some discrepancies between Kid Cudi's testimony and some of the other witnesses' testimony. But actually, I think that's a strength. I mean, they're not telling exactly the same story, but the theme is the same. So it seems less practiced, less rehearsed. I think the more the better. And from different stations of life, telling essentially the same story while varying in detail, I think that's very strong.
I feel like it has been kind of one-sided, our conversation today about the government, simply because we've heard their evidence, their witnesses. So far, we haven't heard from the defense, but I feel like we can't count them out. I mean, P. Diddy, he's got some money in the bank or in a brown paper bag, depending on how you look at it, but he's got a great team and a big team too. So I feel like they're going to bring something. What do you expect from his defense?
You make a great point. If we didn't think the prosecution was scoring points now, then they'd be in real trouble because we've only heard half the story. And there have been some hints in the cross-examination where they're going to go. To me, the big question is whether Diddy testifies. And I know the standard conventional wisdom is you never have your client testify in a criminal trial. But I think this is a case where it might make sense for him to do it. Remember, of course, he just needs one juror. He's obviously, for all we've seen on the video, he's obviously a compelling figure. He's obviously a charismatic figure, very intelligent. You don't get to the position that he achieved without having a lot of talent and without having a lot of personality and without having a lot of ego. So I could see him pushing back on the advice not to testify. And I know that testifying would open him up to cross-examination on all these civil suits and all the other alleged bad acts he's done in his life, but it'd be a big gamble. But I could see him testifying.
Last question I have to ask you, just because I have you here. You were part of another huge trial that many of our viewers have watched, in which your client, Johnny Depp, went on the stand and you had to think about all those things. Cross-exam, the jury, how are they going to react? So kind of putting yourself in the shoes of having experienced something like that with a celebrity who the jurors are already familiar, how do you think Diddy's team would then prepare?
Well, it's very different because that was a civil case and Mr. Depp had the burden of proof. We knew that he could carry his burden. And so that really wasn't a question for us. In this case, this is a much different case. We're dealing with a defendant whose liberty is at stake. I think you prepare him intensely. And I think one of the cardinal things you tell him to do, as you would in a civil case too, is to instruct him to the extent you can instruct him, but advise him not to show any anger. And that his role in a way is to make himself a victim. In other words, take on full responsibility for the domestic abuse. You can't apologize more contritely. I mean, you just have to lay it on the line. Getting emotional would be good in terms of, this is not the legacy I want to leave for my children and my grandchildren. It pains me to have my mother see this, that kind of thing. But then come back and say, but I'm not a criminal. I'm not I'm not a racketeer. I had legitimate businesses and this isn't right. And I think he has a story he could tell, but on the cross-examination, I think you just have to concede an awful lot. And prosecution has to be careful. You always have to be careful on cross-examination. But I can imagine if them continuing to hit him on domestic abuse, if he's already conceded that, in a weird way, he could become, at least in the eyes of one or two jurors, a victim. In other words, I've already heard about this. He's already apologized. I mean, we've heard him bare his soul. Maybe there is a point to what he's saying. Maybe this really isn't a RICO. I think of RICO and I think of the mafia. I think of things like this. And I think, again, he only needs one or two. And I think he's got a potential shot.
If we've learned anything about P. Diddy, I feel like he would want to tell his story, which I would love for him to testify because I want to hear what he's got to say. So I guess we'll wait and see what the defense has up their sleeves. For today, though, Ben Chu, thank you for coming on Scandal and discussing the case with us.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I'd love to come back.
I'm telling ya, we've still got a lot more to come in this case. The government is expected to wrap up sometime next week, I think potentially toward the end of next week. And after that, the defense, what do they have up their sleeves? Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see. You can subscribe to our channel now so that you don't miss anything because we will have updates when that time comes. Send tips our way too. Our email is scandal@lawandcrime.com. I love seeing your emails and your comments on our videos too. That's all we have today for Scandal. I'm your host, Sierra Gillespie, and I'll see you next time.